Hi everyone, my name's BJ and I'm a genealogist and genealogy librarian in Maine. And today's program is going to be sort of a quick one. And I don't want to sound preachy, but it's things that I wish people had been more emphatic about telling me when I started, because it's very easy to, these days, just start at Ancestry, find my past, my heritage, or family search and jump in all excited about what you're finding, but find that you've made life harder for yourself in several months. So, um, the bits I'm going to talk about tonight, as I said, are things I wish people had been better about telling me when I was new to genealogy. And they're things I've seen lots of people I've worked with as library patrons stumble on. So, that's why I chose these to talk about briefly. Any one of these, there are multiple videos at YouTube and other places, classes at Legacy Family Tree webinars, your local genealogical society, your local library. Um, so I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm just going to give you a hint of some things to think about as you start researching. So the first one to remember is that events are recorded where they happen. And so, for example, a couple greats grandmother of mine lived in a little town north of Boston all her life. But when she was in her 70s, she traveled by train, this is in the 1890s, to Chicago for a granddaughter's wedding and died when she was in Chicago. So for years, I couldn't find her death record. And fortunately, eventually, as websites like Ancestry developed, I was able to find her death record in Chicago. Fortunately, she had an unusual mother's maiden name, so I'm pretty sure it is indeed her, especially since the informant was her daughter, who also has an unusual married name. So, obviously, if you've got a John Smith whose mother was Ann Thompson, that's going to be a lot harder to prove. The other one, I've seen this even in the 20th century where people get tripped up with records because somebody lived in one town and died in the hospital two towns over, or gave birth in the hospital two towns over. So that's just something you want to keep in mind. And other things have other jurisdictions. You know, figuring out, is it a county probate court? Is there a probate district? Is there a different office that handles wills and probate, for example? Same thing with deeds. There are actually a couple states here in New England where deeds are handled at the town level, not the county level. So that's something to keep in mind, is where it happened and what organization, agency, etc., had the jurisdiction. For the most part, you are not going to find, say in England, Methodist records in Church of England books, but sometimes you do. Same thing in Scotland. You will get dissenters whose baptisms are recorded in Church of Scotland established church records. So that's one thing to remember, is you want to make sure you're looking in the right place. This is a big one. Names can be very flexible. Spelling, what name a person uses, in it, records by nickname, initials, middle name. Here in the U.S. and through most of the English-speaking world, the idea that we have one official, only changes for women when they get married name is very much a 20th century invention, generally having to do with the start of Social Security and similar programs. But if you think about it, if you're a farmer in Maine in 1800, You don't really need ID. When you go to pay taxes, you go to the town hall. It's probably your cousin behind the counter as clerk. There's no driver's license, no health insurance card, no social security card, probably not a passport for traveling, um, no retired military ID, no credit card because plastic hasn't been invented at this point. So names were flexible. You didn't need to do an official change. Um, I have one case, again, a couple greats grandmother. In a 13 or 14-year period, I find her with 4 last names: her father's, her stepfather's, her mother's maiden name because she's living in a census with her mother's parents, and the census taker evidently just put down the grandfather's name, last name for everybody, and then her husband's name. Um, so you want to be flexible. You may well find a William in a record as a Bill or as a WH. Um, and in with this, names were not changed at Ellis Island or by other immigration. They were checked off a manifest generated in Europe or wherever the ship came from. Um, and even if they had changed them, people could have just walked out the door of Ellis Island or wherever and gone back to using their original name if they'd wanted to. There was no documentation needed. So that's something to be aware of, that names are flexible. You want to be flexible. When I first started doing this almost 30 years ago, I was helping out at a genealogy center, and a woman insisted her family had always spelled the last name, her surname Reed, R-E-I-D, and would not consider anyone with it was R-E-A-D or R-E-E-D or any other variation. And let's just say that if she hasn't gotten flexible on that, she's still looking. My mother's maiden name I have found spelled, well, there's a core group of 6 or 8 ways that it's spelled most frequently, but I found about another 30 where I've got 1 or 2 of the spelling variations. So that's something, again, just something to be aware of. Write everything down. You may think you will remember it in 6 months because it's new and exciting now, but in 6 months, more new and exciting bits and everyday life will have pushed it out of your brain. Write it down, where you got it, what it says, all of that. This is a big one. Family stories may be right, they may be partly right, or they may be outright wrong. I grew up on the story that my grandfather and his 3 brothers, who were living in, born and lived in Scotland, their oldest sister had married and moved to Toronto. And when their mother died, Aunt Bella wrote to my great grandfather and said, "Why don't you send some of the younger boys to Canada? Don't know if it's going much of anywhere, but my husband just got a job at this new place called Kodak. You might as well send a couple of them, and my husband will get them a job." So I didn't look into that story. Years later, 10 years or so into my researching, I was helping somebody look for her ancestors at Ellis Island. And because my grandfather's name was English in English and hers was in Polish, I looked for my grandfather because I knew he'd gone back a couple times for fighting in World War I and at least one other time. So I thought maybe I'd catch him on one of those trips. Well, lo and behold, he arrived in New York 3 days after the 1910 census by himself, going to an aunt in Cleveland. Turns out he was there and then with another aunt in rural New York before he went and met up with the sister and the other 3 brothers who had indeed gone directly from Scotland to Canada. So my family story was 75% right. Three brothers did what I'd been told they'd done, and my grandfather did something slightly different. Ended up in the same place, but was definitely took a different voyage. So check the family stories as best you can. This is another big one. The way things have been done has changed over time. Immigration laws, immigration forms, naturalization laws, naturalization forms. Um, Sometimes a wife isn't mentioned in a will, and that's because she automatically got a third and didn't need to be put in the will. Same thing sometimes with the first son. He got an automatic share, um, or an automatic double share in some cases. How deeds and wills are recorded, who oversaw it changed. Um, Legal adoption didn't happen until, in some places like Scotland, the 20th century. Um, so that's something to keep in mind, is that just because it's done one way now or was done one way 50 years ago doesn't mean that's how it was done 150 years ago. A little background knowledge can go a long way. The big genealogy websites have made it really easy to jump in with both feet. And it's fun. But once you start to go beyond the fun and want to really do some research, a little background knowledge about the time and place you're researching, what records are available, what were some of, did the wife get an automatic third of a husband's estate as the dower? How often were censuses taken? Are you mostly going to find civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths? Or are you mostly going to find church records of baptisms, bans, and burials? There are several ways to do this. There are books about, an introduction to Irish genealogy, an introduction to Italian genealogy. The Family Search Wiki has a lot of good information. So taking a look at that can be helpful for your location, can be helpful. Another example, in the countries that are coming out of a civil law environment, so France, Spain, Italy, and the colonies that those countries had, notaries serve a very different function than they do in the English-speaking world. In the English-speaking world, notaries really only look at verifying identities and signatures, whereas in the civil law countries, they do much more with writing marriage contracts, with bills of sale, with inheritance records, all sorts of things like that. So you might, if you're searching in Quebec, Mexico, France, Italy, you may miss a huge type of record if you don't know that. And that's the sort of thing that wikis, the research wiki at Family Search, can help you figure out. Online trees are a very mixed blessing. Don't ignore them, but do not, I highly recommend, do not just add things from a tree you see online to your tree without doing some more research. I've found some absolute bloopers. Men getting married at 3 years old and fathering a child the next year, women having children at the age of 87 or getting married 13 years after they've died. But even bigger are the relationships. way too many people will take something where, for example, I have a couple greats grandfather, and all the marriage record says is John Ralston married Helen Gardner and the date. Nothing further identifying either of them. And they were in a big city, they were in Glasgow, Scotland. So it's not really easy. It's not like it's a small town where I can make some relatively good guesses as to who their families might be. But people have taken that John Ralston and grafted 3 different fathers onto him in different trees online. None of them with anything other than it's an older male Ralston in the right neighborhood. So you want to be really careful. You want to be especially careful if an online tree connects you to something, to a prestigious ancestor. Um, there's an early settler in Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts, where someone invented an entire big long lineage for him and actually gave him a son who is nowhere recorded in contemporary records with a name to connect it all together. Um, and as far as those of us who've researched him have looked into, the son didn't exist and the father's origins are unknown. But you'll find the 11 generation pedigree back to nobility all over the genealogy internet. So, as I said, those are some things I would have liked to have been told more firmly when I started. This is just an overview, but as you do your research, think about these, and there are lots of good learning opportunities online and offline. Um, Never forget to check out your local library, your local genealogical society, your local historical society, to see what resources they have of someone to help you, records that are relevant, and just books and other information about getting started in a new place to research so that you can have some of the background knowledge and save yourself some time because you know what you should be looking for. So hope this helps you a little. Um, and I'll be back next week with something maybe a little more exciting, but this is really sort of foundational information that I thought you might like.